Okay.
So can you try to mute everyone, but leave the option to unmute themselves? No. But I guess everybody mostly.
I think everyone knows how to unmute
All
themselves.
right. Okay.
So we're
So then I will start. Um, Hi again, guys. I'm Zhe, and I will be delivering the presentation on Hernan Cortes and the last stand of Aztecs night. This is the second part, or rather the continuation of the talk that I did um, in late February. That was Hernan Cortes and Emperor Moctezuma. Since it's a continuation of the first part, I will do a brief overview of what we talked about. So kind of the sum up of the previous uh, of the part one of the show. Um, and so I'll try to do that in the next 10 minutes, and then we will go for another hour um, um, talking to kind of new material, the second part of the story. So the year was 1492, and great visionary and great seaman and Japanese merchant by the name um, Christopher Columbus sailed due west from Europe over Atlantics under contract with the Crown of Spain to find the new route to India. Um, After a few weeks um, on high seas, Columbus was successful and he discovered, let's use the word discovery for the sake of this presentation, something that we now know as Caribbeans, but he named West Indies because indeed he believed that he reached um, Asia. Um, for the next, all of a sudden, Spain became an empire because they received domains very far from the Iberian coast, um, as Columbus duly claimed all these lands for the crown of Spain. For the next 15 years, Spain was trying to colonize the territory all around the modern-day Caribbean Sea. But while they were successful of actually gaining the territory and landing there and establishing some settlements, it was a very failing enterprise financially. It was not a successful enterprise at all. And there were two reasons for that. One, the lands themselves were not particularly rich, the resources were poor. And the second reason was that Columbus, his family, his brothers, and everyone that they brought along, almost everyone, were completely incapable to run anything, to build anything. They were very bad administrators. Um, One notable exception was island of Cuba, right in the middle of the map, the biggest island over there, which was relatively successful. In fact, it was the most successful colony that Spain had at the time. And it had to do with that Cuba had better resources than the rest of the Caribbeans, but it also had to do a lot with that man on the picture, the Diego Velazquez de Cuellar, who was the able governor of Cuba. He did a lot of things right. One of the best things that he did, he built a very profitable shipbuilding industry. He developed it. As Cuba was getting richer and richer, Velasquez was getting richer, richer, was getting full of himself, and he decided that Cuba was not enough, and he wanted to govern more territories, better, richer territories, and he started sending expeditions due west to modern-day Yucatan Peninsula and modern-day central Mexico. After a few of such expeditions that cost him a lot, he, however, assembled enough intelligence, enough knowledge to decide to conquer central Mexico. Um, for that final and most important expedition, he needed a leader, and his pick was a young man at the time, his protege and the nephew by marriage, the gentleman by the name Hernan Cortes. Cortes was a learned man. He knew Latin, had somewhat almost an proper education. He attended university for a few years. He was at the same time a very good fighter. He was a lawyer by profession, but he didn't mind to work with his hands and work in mines if it was required. Um, he was certainly smart, intelligent, and audacious man. So he was a good person to lead an official conquering expedition. Both of the men knew that Velasquez doesn't have authorization to send somebody to conquer the new land, to declare war on natives. He could only send scouting expeditions. And both men were fine with that. That will do something that officially is not allowed. The love relationship between two men, however, ended quickly because Velasquez, quite rightfully, got suspicious that Hernan Cortes has a mind of his own, and that if his expeditions to conquer the new lands westward in the mainland will be successful, he is going to try to install himself as a governor of the new land and not pass that honors and all the power and all the riches to Velasquez to manage. Velasquez tried to stop Cortes first by diplomacy and then by force, but Cortes acted quickly and he left Cuba with half of the ships originally meant to go with him. However, he sort of acted first and he left without authorization from Velasquez. Velasquez was mad, but it was too late. It's probably a good point to mention that Cortes, even though he went unofficially without authorization, had a support of almost everyone of the expeditionary force that he went with him. Most importantly, had the support of the wild, rough boys of Conquest, particularly of Pedro Alvarado and Gonzalo Sandoval, shown here, the two men that everybody were afraid of. They were not only locals, the other conquistadors were doing what those guys would say. They were such a good fighters and so rough and fearless, everybody were like afraid of them. And they liked Cortes for very different reasons, but they were close friends and they became his close captains. As Cortes traveled with a lot of adventures, he eventually reached what's now Gulf of Mexico, the coast of Gulf of Mexico, and he was met by friendly locals that were indeed very happy to see Spaniards, and they provided everything Spaniards wanted, and in exchange they wanted a protection from the Spaniards from evil overlord Aztec Empire. So Cortes learned from the locals that there is indeed a huge country, huge empire, Aztec or Mexico, that is in size, indeed, roughly the size of Iberian Peninsula, that is populated by about 20 million people, more than Iberian Peninsula, and that's being ruled from a capital called Tenochtitlan, the city of dreams, the very well-built, stone-built capital of 200,000 people, bigger than anything of those people ever seen. And the capital is located on an island, on a lake, in the Valley of Mexico, surrounded by the mountains. And the rule from that capital is supported by the army of about 100,000 seasoned warriors. And then Cortes learned that despite all that, this Aztec civilization just enters Bronze Age. So they have no hard metals to speak of. And so their weaponry is extremely inferior to what Spaniards brought with them, the Iberian steel. They also were inferior in all sorts of science of war, from not having horses to not having attack dogs, for not even knowing anything about tactics. So Cortes obviously saw that was great. Spaniards saw it was great. Otherwise, the civilization was quite developed. For the civilization that just was entering Bronze Age, they had very complex social structures. They had complex religion system. They had schools. They had doctors. They had ceramics. They had embroidery. They have textile. They were quite advanced civilization, except that they were like locking metals. The empire was ruled by Tlaoli, the one who speaks. We're roughly going to call this person emperor. And at the time, the emperor of Aztecs was the man by the name Montezuma. Montezuma was the great emperor, except he wasn't really great. In fact, Montezuma was the weakest of any rulers that Aztecs ever had. He was a deeply religious man who was ruling not by the common sense and not by the advice of his high council, not by any logic, but mostly by prophecies, by signs, by comet flyings, by dream interpretations. His rule was very unbeneficial, detrimental to the country in general, even before Spaniards arrived. And everybody were pretty much waiting for him to die already, because he was an older man. But by his position, he was certainly great Emperor Montezuma. Besides everything else, Aztecs, and Montezuma in particular, were extremely into the practice of human sacrifice. If everyone, or almost everyone, in what's now Central Mexico and Mesoamerica were into this practice to a certain extent, Aztecs over the last 300 years took that practice to the new heights. They wanted more and more, and Montezuma was particularly into the sacrifice. That learned Aztecs a lot of animosity amongst the people they control, amongst their vassals, because not only they didn't like that a lot of laws and rules that were coming from the capital didn't make sense, because Montezuma could order not to start harvest because there was no sufficient science for that, and people saw their harvest rotting because the rain starts, but there is no command from the capital to do that. But they also didn't like to send more and more of their own people to Aztecs to be killed for the sake of the gods. So actually, there was a lot of people, a lot of tribes at the time of Spanish arrival that didn't like the rule of Aztecs, specifically because Montezuma wasn't doing a good job. Cortes contemplated for a while whether he is in a position to conquer this this land. Basically, it was the territory he believed was ripe for conquering, and there was a lot of gold that they had enough evidence that there is a lot of gold and riches, but and he knew that in terms of weaponry, his small army was going to overpower the enemy, the Aztecs. He was afraid of the sheer numbers because he had 800 people with him, 500 of whom were warriors, and he was facing the army that potentially can be tens of thousands of people over every single battle. Eventually, the greed prevailed. Cortes decided that there was too much to gain by trying to conquer this land. Too much gold and silver, too much land, too many peoples that can be made into the slaves. At least at that point, he thought about that. And so he decided to try to travel from the coast, where he was at the moment, all the way to the capital. And so he did. And there was a lot of adventures along the way that we talked about last time. But eventually, he arrived. Should see his. He arrived to the Valley of Mexico, shown here on the map, that was covered by the lakes, as we discussed last times. Pretty much he arrived unmolested to the Valley of Mexico. Along the way, the two most important, besides all the adventures, two most important things happened. He picked up an extremely intelligent female that we know as La Malinche, or Doña Marina, a person who was his interpreter, as she spoke various languages, who would become his lover, and who also became his most trusted advisor, somebody who really understood the psyche of the locals and who was responsible for a lot of decisions that Cortes was making. The second superbly important fact is that Cortes made numerous allies among the tribes that were unhappy with Aztec rules, and most important allies were very warlike, very brave nations of Tlaxcalans that really hated Aztecs to begin with, so they made the natural allies, and they were extremely trusted and loyal allies to Cortes. Still, as Cortes arrived to the Valley of Mexico, there was an issue of entering the city, because the city was located on the island, The city was located on an island, and it was difficult to penetrate because the only way to march there was over the viaducts that Aztecs built, and the viaducts were like the stone platforms with huge holes between them that were covered by the wooden bridges that could be easily removed if needed. Um, and so fighting their way into the capital would be extremely difficult for Cortes. Unfortunately for the Aztecs, their leader, Montezuma, against advice of his military generals, against his high consul, even against his priests, allowed, not just allowed, he invited Cortes and his men to enter the capital, and there was they pretty much entered the city and were received as a guest of honor, were given the huge palace with huge and very thick stone walls that, given the lack of any firearms, were pretty much like it was a castle. The Indians couldn't enter it. It was they couldn't penetrate these walls of the castle. So they were given the great place to stay and defend themselves if needed. They were given everything that they wanted. Montezuma was taken care of for a week, that everything that Spaniards may want is provided to them, and Spaniards paid greatly to all this hospitality, using some pretense. A week later, they actually arrested Montezuma and took him as a prisoner to their palace. And that was absolutely ingenious because now they had control of the emperor, and they felt that they were invincible at this point. For a while, Montezuma, the great Emperor Montezuma, was staying as a guest prisoner in the palace alongside the Spaniards. And for a while, things were kind of okay for him because he actually continued to rule. The only thing that Cortes and his friends seemed to wanted was gold, and that kept being delivered to them. And it's quite possible that at this point, Cortes saw that that's how the thing's going to end, because he realized that he doesn't have force to conquer the whole country. He cannot control he cannot fight these armies in front of him. So he's going to just have Montezuma, while still ruling the country from another palace, deliver as much gold and silver as possible, and then they will just take off and return to the coast and go to Spain, present the case to king, and that's going to be the end of it. That was about the gold. However, as Cortes was contemplating that plan, his plans were changed by his former friend Diego Velázquez, who now received permissions from king for official conquest of mainland, and sent his friend Panfilo de Narvaez with armada of 18 ships to conquer the lands, the same lands that Cortes already had in his possession somewhat, and to arrest and potentially execute Hernan Cortes for treason. After trying diplomacy, which failed, Cortes left his second in command, Pedro Alvarado, to guard the city and to guard the Montezuma, and himself went to the coast secretly, surprised the Narvaez with night attack, took him prisoner, injured him, and then had little problems convincing the rest of the Narvaez forces to join his successful expedition. He also used one of the ships to send it back to Spain, one of the Narvaez ships to send us back to Spain with loads of gold and silver for King of Spain and to his father. However, he received at the same time, he couldn't really celebrate the victory over another Spaniard, as he received a notice from the capital that Pedro Alvarado was besieged, and the Aztecs revolted against Alvarado and against Cortes. Once he arrived in the capital, Alvarado, and he was allowed actually to enter the palace, Alvarado explained to him that what happened while Cortes was away, there was a festival dedicated to asking gods to stop heat that is killing the land in the months of May, and to allow the rain season to start in the months of June. As it was common, the festival for the rain gods were not just about chanting and dancing and drumming, but also was about a lot of human sacrifice. Unfortunately, I was happening right in front of the palace where Spaniards stayed, and it proved to be, all the sacrifices proved to be too much for the rough man Pedro Alvarado, who released his soldiers, who went there and killed a lot of people, unprotected people, people who had no weaponry with them. Spaniards went there in a Catholic fever and killed about 1,000 people just like that. They killed most of the nobility, most of the military leaders, most of the high priests, because everybody who were celebrating this festival in the center of the city of Tenochtitlan were obviously not just random people. They were like the best, the most noble people of the nation, and most of them got killed by Spaniards in pretty much matter of an hour. When Aztecs, the common people, and the rest of the military realized what happened, they rebelled. They surrounded the capital, and they surrounded the palace where Spaniards stayed. And while they were not able to get inside, and actually were not at the time even trying to get inside, they besieged it pretty much. Cortes went to talk to Montezuma, who was obviously still within the palace, and asked him to stop this from happening and ask people to go home. Montezuma replied that the people lost any respect for him after what Spaniards did and after him pleading with the people. So he's not really an emperor. So Cortes asked him what's next, and Montezuma suggested that his brother Cuauhtémoc should be released from, who also was in the palace, and that's how he survived the massacre on the plaza, that he would be released and from the palace, and he would be pronounced the new emperor, and he will be able to calm people. Cortes agreed to that. He wasn't happy about the idea, but he agreed to that. His hesitation proved to be correct this time, as this only time that that Montezuma was able to dupe Cortes, because upon his release from the palace, Cuauhtémoc was not just pronounced emperor. He pretty much told everyone that Spaniards put the caste and chanted Montezuma. Montezuma lost his soul, and now they need to avenge him, and now they actually need to declare the full war against the Spaniards and took the palace by force. And the true fighting between the Spaniards that were staying in the castle and the Aztec began. Cortes brought Montezuma out one day to try to calm his people, and while Montezuma was doing that, he was hit by the stone thrown by some of his people, and the wound proved to be fatal. And so the great Emperor Montezuma, the last great emperor of Aztecs, the last one to have that title, the great emperor, not just emperor, was killed by the rock or by the stone thrown by his own people. That was the end of Montezuma. And I hope now that I'm done with содержание предыдущей серии. We guys gonna start the new material from here. I hope that was fast and concise. So Montezuma died, duped by Cortes on many occasions, victim to his own religious beliefs and religious fever, not able to comprehend realities, not listening to his cool-minded counsel, but also misreading the Spaniards being a victim to cultural misunderstanding, thinking that if he throws a lot of gold and silver at Spaniards, they would leave and let him rule, uh, which of course had the opposite effect. As the more gold and silver he would deliver to Spaniards, the more they wanted and the more there was their resolve to stay in these lands. His death, however, was his personal death, but it wasn't just yet um, the death of Aztecs or Aztec Empire. The confrontation between the Aztec Empire and the Spanish Empire was still there, and nobody could tell at that moment who will end up victorious. Nobody, even if we can assume that Spanish Empire would eventually prevail if the king had resolved to send the regular army, it wasn't clear who's going to be victorious in the battle of the new emperor and his Aztec armies and current band of Hernan Cortes and his conquistadors. At the moment, what Cortes realized that Montezuma, he's the only native ally left, is dead. His castle is surrounded.
I can listen
and,
on the phone.
and the Aztecs are trying to get inside the palace, inside the castle, and kill them all. And they're working on that very hard, trying to get through the walls, while Spaniards firing at them from guns, arquebusks, and what's not. Cortes was realizing that even if Aztecs are not successful in getting through the walls, they're eventually just gonna die of hunger and thirst. There were no resources coming in. There was only that much in the palace, and Alvarado was there besieged for several weeks prior to Cortes' arrival. The resources will end pretty soon. So Cortes decided that they need to get out from the palace and they need to get out from the island. This is the ceremonial center, and Cortes were staying in that palace on the right side. Nearby, there was a pyramid that Aztecs used as a commanding post. They were like observing from the top of it what Spaniards were doing in the courtyard, and they were trying to throw rocks from there. Though it was too fine. They were not particularly successful. Cortes decided to build war machine like medieval wagons, something like that, except that they added the second floor to that. So the Tlaxcalan's allies would be staying inside and pushing it from inside, and Spaniards would fire arquebusks and muskets, and at the second floor they would have a real gun that would be shooting at the enemies. And the ball, the gun ball can go through dozens of people, killing them. So that was an interesting idea. So the carpenters built few of those machines. Spaniards opened the door and they let them out, and there was such a surprise seeing like kind of tower moving on its own on wheels that Aztecs never seen before, that they wouldn't attack it right away, and Spaniards start firing at them. And so they were able to carry two of those wagons all the way to that pyramid. And Cortes, who was there himself, with a number of his warriors, would jump in the pyramids, would overpower easily native warriors, go up through the priests and high command from there to the ground and observe the city. And what they saw, they didn't like. What they saw is that the entire city was in arms and more were marching. And though it was difficult because they were like most of the viaducts were by now partially destroyed, and and the wooden bridges were removed. But there was already like tens and tens of thousands of warriors. Cortes really hated what he saw. They went down the pyramid. They used the wagons again to come back. Though the way back was much more successful, they lost one of the wagons. They lost one of the guns, and they barely made it back to the castle. while military success of that operation was very dubious, Cortes now knew for sure that he should to get out. The major reason for that was this. Um, one of the viaducts was still intact, and they could see that being intact. And what was going on? That viaduct, the shortest ones, was leading to the city of Tacuba. Tacuba sided early on with Cortes. And so they were hated by Aztecs right now. They were previously Aztecs allies, and now they were sort of fifth column that sided with the enemy. They were reinforced by the Tlaxcalan army who stayed in Tacuba. And so they were preventing Aztecs from demantailing, from destroying the last viaduct that was connecting city with the shores, the island with the shore. Cortes decided that it was time to use that viaduct to move out. What some of his captains, who was also on the tower, mentioned as there were like the wooden bridges, at least in two places, were already removed. So Cortes ordered his carpenters to take the wood from the remaining machines that they had and build very long bridges out of that, which carpenters did in a few hours' time. The next thing was the issue of gold. There was 8 tons of gold total accumulated in the palace. Cortes took with him, divided everything in 5 parts and took 1/5 that was to be sent to the king. That treasure was not to be lost for in any circumstances, because king was already knew about this treasure from the Cortes letters, and he had to deliver that gold to the king if he wants to be governor at any point in his life. The rest of it, he told his people that they can take as much as they can care on their persons. He did warn them, however, that the one who travels safest at night is the one who travels light. His own people took that advice close to heart. Bernardino de Castilla, one of the people on whose eyewitness account we rely in when we read and learn about the events, wrote some 50 years later that all he took was some semi-precious stones that he knew were very light stones that he knew were very popular with locals. He also took a bunch of quetzalcoatl feathers. Quetzalcoatl feathers. It's a parrot bird with a very long green feathers, and it lives in Guatemala and southern Oaxaca. So the bird doesn't live in central Mexico. So its feathers are very, very, very expensive in central Mexico, among the Aztec people. As more senior and smart conquistadors, so how Tlaxcalans don't take anything but take those light feathers with them as their share of loot, they would do the same. And those things, these light semi-precious stones and the feathers would go a very long way once they actually get out, much more than the gold that locals didn't care for. All right. The newcomers, the people who arrived at the Narvaez, who didn't see the gold before, for whom it all was very new, they loaded the sum heavily. They were taking as much gold as they could carry in their bags, and for many of them, that eventually spelled death because they were very heavy traveling to cross the water, as we will find out. The plan that Cortes devised was following. They would leave the what's called Sacred Princess over there and travel north. Well, first he said, Alvarado, who was responsible for all this mess because under his watch, the city rebelled because he allowed his people to kill the nobility of the city, would go first, right after midnight. And he will go all the way north to the causeway, to the viaduct, to Tepeyac. They knew that the causeway was mostly destroyed by now. They knew that maybe suicidal mission. That was a decoy. If there were people waiting for them, if there were warriors waiting for them at night, they would follow Alvarado. Alvarado and his men were given horses. So at least hopefully they will be able to escape. But that was quite a kind of suicidal mission. 15 minutes later, after their Alvarado and his men would leave, the main party would use another street to go to Causeway to Tlacopan. Tlacopan is another name for Tacuba, and will go over the last remaining intact or somewhat intact causeway to Tacuba. That was the plan. Why there was an idea that the palace may not be guarded and the city may not be guarded by all those tens of thousands of warriors? Well, surprisingly, that has to do with the rain. Remember how the whole thing, why the festival was taking place, was during which a lot of nobility were killed by Alvarado's men. The reason for that was the May is extremely hot months. The start of June is extremely hot months. People often ask me, is it a good time to travel to Mexico? And in the summer, is it too hot? No. As long as you go end of July, end of June, July, or August, because the rain season starts. Aztecs were asking for the rain to start. Gods usually grants this wish. By the June 15, roughly, rain starts. But Aztecs, they need rain, but they don't like it. They don't like darkness, and they don't like rain. So there would be contingent always guarding the main gates from the palace. But as Malinche reported at the time, she sneaked out several nights in a row through the secondary door on the sides, and there were nobody there. Most Aztecs warriors would go home for the rainy nights. And so the plan was taken to execution. On June Torres of 1520, Cortes would leave right after midnight. First, Alvarado would leave from the secondary gates and went due north. Nobody actually was following him. And then the main party would go on a separate route, also north, and then to the causeways to Tacuba. For a while, plan worked. Alvarado got to his causeways without problems, and Cortes and his people got to the causeways without a problem. They entered the causeways, the viaduct. They traveled for some time. The first two drops, the gaps in the viaducts were still covered. Then they reached the one that wasn't covered, that where the wooden bridge was removed, and they installed the one they were carrying with themselves, the mobile one. And as soon as they entered that viaduct, things went to hell. It turns out that was a trap. The Aztecs were waiting for them. The lake just flamed. It turns out there are like thousands, maybe hundreds, but probably thousands of canoes waiting for them. That would bring Aztec warriors from both sides of the viaduct, and they would attack. In addition, it turns out that the streets and the houses and the palaces that were like on the way to the causeway, people were hiding there. And Aztec warriors would leave them and would attack Cortes' army from the back. So they were surrounded on three sides with the only forward to run, except as they were running forward, they reached the second gap and they couldn't make it through that. They were surrounded by the water on one side and by the enemies on two sides. So the battle for the first battle for the Tenochtitlan was commenced this way. Now, some scholars over there call that first battle for Tenochtitlan. It doesn't work. It wasn't battle for Tenochtitlan because actually Spaniards were trying to leave it. It was maybe for Aztecs, it was battle for their home because they were expulsion that the Spaniards, they were sending that over interlopers of, but it wasn't really battle. But more importantly, it wasn't really battle either. It was a disaster. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a retreat from the city for Cortes either. It was butchery. Maybe butchery is a bad word because Aztecs were dying too, but they were killing Spaniards as Spaniards never seen before. That was a complete disaster for the Spaniards. Their horses were slipping out and falling into the water. They were back moving and slipping into the water. There was no way to keep order. Every man was fighting for himself, being attacked on all sides, and dying for himself. Aztecs, if their spears wouldn't work, they didn't mind dying. And their religion and their worldview, that was fine. They would jump from the canoes on the Spaniards and die while dying by being killed, would drag them into the water, and Spaniards would drown because they were too heavy. Their armor was too heavy. So I was pretty bad. I was pretty bad for a while. In the matter of 2 hours, Cortes lost more than half of his people. His numbers in the capital was 1,200, and about 700 people died that night. And there were 3 reasons why almost half of them survived. First reason was very gross. I mean, all of them very gross, but the first one was particularly gross. Cortes, who was in the vanguard fighting, got his horse killed from underneath, and he actually fell into the water. He was pulled out by 2 of his soldiers, but he told them, or he realized, that by now, after 2 hours of fighting, they can walk over the water, because there are so many bodies of killed warriors on both sides. There are so many bodies of drowned horses, and the lake is shallow, just 3-4 meters. They can pretty much made it across the gap. And so they went, and many of them made it. Once Cortes made it over, he ran towards Tacuba, and at the same time he realized that Tacubans and Tlaxcalans warriors actually been fighting against the Aztecs too, and moving towards them. They brought Cortes one of the horses they left in Tacuba. Cortes mounted the horse and rode back to the gap, continuing to fight. The Spaniards sought to crossing over the dead bodies of the enemies and friends alike. That's how the people in the vanguards, whoever remained, were making to Tacuba. The second reason was, surprisingly, the suicidal, not suicidal, quite controversial, unsuicidal Pedro Alvarado and the suicidal mission. As they reached the northern viaduct, they tried to cross it. It was destroyed. He got nothing to do, so he went to the other viaduct, trying to join his compatriots crossing westwards to Tacuba. As he approached, he saw the huge mass of Aztec warriors, and as they were cavalry, because they were given horses, pretty much all of them, they just charged. They were brave. It was a brave, audacious attack by very skilled warriors, and they did a lot of damage, and most of them died. But they certainly slowed down the attack that was coming from the city, allowing the vanguard kind of regroup and got some, not vanguard, the rear guard to regroup on the viaducts. That was the second thing that helped a lot. And the third thing we will mention later. So anyway, being able to cross that second gap allowed a lot of Spaniards to escape and went all the way to Tacuba. Once in Tacuba, Cortes expected that Aztecs will, from the canoes, will land and will continue fighting on land, but Aztecs, for some reasons, were not doing that. Cortes didn't have time to dwell on that. He just commanded every Romanian man to move to the city, where Tlaxcalans and Tacuba, as he found out, were fighting Aztecs, who were able to repulse their attack from the mainland, and then he took his Romanian forces, including Tlaxcalans and Tacubans, up north to the woods. There in the woods, realizing that Aztecs were not following him for whatever reason, Cortes demounted and is known to cry under the huge cypress tree. It was crying for a few minutes, and When Tlaxcalan's allies asked him why he's crying, he said he wasn't crying for his wounds, even though he was wounded quite badly. He wasn't crying out of fear. He wasn't crying for the gold that apparently was lost. He was only crying for his fallen comrades. He felt sorrow for them, and since then, the June Torres 1520 is known in Spanish sources as Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Then again, Cortes didn't had never dwell too much on the past. He figured out. Um, he started counting who is in, and while half of his forces, more than half of his forces, died, it turns out that it is a Hollywood story. Uh, it is like the um, uh, the fight for Winterfell, when turns out that so many people die, but all the main character survives. Alvarado survived somehow. I mean, I was a dead marsh, and he survived. Bernal Diaz de Castillo survived. If he didn't, we wouldn't have his reports that he wrote 50 years after the events. Sandoval survived. Malinche survived. Um, he was all golden. There was one thing he needed to check, and he asked the most trusted person to do that. He asked Malinche to go and see if one particular person is still with them, and that was the Gaspar Garcias, who was the main carpenter of the expedition. He didn't tell anybody anything else. He just asked you to go and check. She calmly went among the dying people and wounded people and weeping people and wounded horses, and she returned and calmly informed him that he's still there. Cortes mounted to his horse and telling his captains that we should move because we're lacking nothing. He made a speech to his comrades that there is no hero in the human history he wouldn't have a defeat, because what kind of hero you are if you're not fighting against the odds? Everybody would have a defeat once in a while, but then there is a resolve, and today they lost the battle, but they're still gonna win the war. And now when they come back, they're gonna have not just gold, but the entire country for themselves. It was a great orator, as we know, and I mean, not like anybody had chance. Cortes said that they're gonna travel up north along the western shores of the city, and then they're gonna go east to Tlaxcala to regroup there. The interesting thing that he did, that as I'm saying during one of my other talks, 303 years later, during the Yucatan Wars between Maya and Spaniards out there, the Spaniards of the 19th century would lead there, right, 400 years later, would lead their wounded sometimes on the field, which was despicable, but people would do it out of fear for their own lives. In 16th century, that was not an option. Sorry, 300 years, yeah. Cortes would have all his wounded taken care for and being brought with them on the march, but he wouldn't use the horses to carry them. He would use Tlaxcalan allies to carry them because he needed horses that pretty much 2,000 horses left out of 100 that he had at the beginning. I mean, at the beginning of the retreat, all of them were wounded, and he wanted them to heal and to freshen up. That was very important. So the last reason why they all survived is that somehow they were not followed by massive Aztecs army. And the reason for that was, of course, Aztec mentality. Aztecs won the battle for Tenochtitlan. They sent Spaniards out. They expelled them from their glorious city. They avenged the damage that they did to their poor emperor Moctezuma. The gods clearly spoken If the gods didn't sign with the Aztecs, they would never able to achieve what they have just done. So clearly, gods do favor the new emperor. They do favor Aztecs. They ask gods for help and gods deliver. So now they need to pay back. There was one thing to leave left to do is to sacrifice those who were taken prisoners. And so as soon as sun went up, they start chanting, drumming, dancing, meditating, and sacrificing Tlaxcalans and Spaniards alike. Tlaxcalans were usually sacrificed with a great deal of honors. Spaniards they hated so much, they considered them dogs. They thought they were bad warriors, and the only thing they had is their weaponry and armor and animals, but they didn't think much of them, which was actually quite a misconception. But anyhow, they were killing them, and they were killing them for hours. They actually overdone themselves, probably out of rage of what the Spaniards did to their city and to themselves and to the emperor. They've done much more than they usually would do. But yeah, that was much more important to them than actually following up on the Cortes and Spaniards and finish them. Huge strategic mistake. Huge. But from their point of worldview, I mean, from their worldview, that's what had to be done. And so Cortes traveled, molested by the small horizons of Aztecs here and there, not able to enter some of the cities that would put resistance, only able to enter the city where like the population would towns would flee for whatever reason, surviving on the food that they would found here and there. His like poor army would be moving eastwards to Tlaxcala. Except eventually, as they were halfway, they the scouts reported as they were in the hills near Atumba, the scouts reported there is a huge army of Aztecs waiting for them in the valley below. We don't know when Cuitlahuac, the new emperor of Aztecs, came out with the plan. Was it his plan from the start to assemble a huge army and finish Spaniards in Atuyamba, or did he eventually came to senses after killing all the prisoners that he should not let Spaniards live alive? But they realized that there were like all the skirmishes that were allowing them to move in the certain directions were to bring them to that valley where like huge valley where Aztecs can assemble what Cortes described to King at 100,000, but probably just few dozen thousands of warriors. There was a battle. It was a close. I mean, there was like numerically, there was like amazing number of Indian warriors, but tactically, or like from the sense of the power, of course, the Spaniards were overmatching them. Um, and after several hours, the battle, the pitch battle, was started at the daybreak and it was going till noon. Um, after several hours of fighting, the Spaniards still stood. Their foot soldiers were maintaining order, and their cavalry was creating a havoc. And it was very interesting. Cuitlahuac and the Aztecs haven't actually seen horses in action because horses had problem. I mean, the horsemen had problem fighting on the streets, especially surrounded by so many people where they cannot move really. When the horses couldn't develop the speed, and where the iron hooves would actually slippery on the stones of the city. Here in the field, the Iberian horses felt right at home, and they were creating a lot of problems for the Aztecs. And so for a few hours, none of the armies was making a lot of advance. The Spanish defense holding strong, but as Bernal Diaz would say later, we were almost done. We were like very close to just being dying of exhaustion. We couldn't fight for much longer. But at this point, Cortes saved the day. He noticed that there were people that clearly were commanders because of the way they were dressed and in a very elaborate ways. And there was a banner system. So he himself led, and he directed a part of the cavalry to charge through Indians to reach these people and to kill them. And that's what they did. And they destroyed the banner. And turns out that there was Kulak half-brother that he killed, the chief commander, the most important general remaining in the country. And the banner was a very important banner for the Aztecs. Seeing all of the high command destroyed by the Spanish cavalry, seeing the banners being destroyed, the Aztec morale just went down in a matter of seconds, and they ran. Spaniards won the battle like this, even though they were outmatched 1-200. There was a high price they paid for that, however, as that on the way returning from victoriously returning from killing the general, Cortes was hit, just like Montezuma, on his head by a rock. Boom. He originally appeared to be okay for some time, then it seemed like concussion, and then he went into coma. Now, as Cortes was in the coma, even though he was placed in a mobile kind of tent, and his captains and Malinche wouldn't tell anybody what's going on. They were not telling them that he's in coma. They were saying that he's injured. But as people didn't see him for the rest of the day, they were kind of worried and what's going to go next. And Malinche, Sandoval, and Alvarado had a council. And Alvarado and Sandoval reported that the soldiers are concerned that Cortes is actually dead, that they're hiding. And now that he's dead, they don't want to go to Tlaxcala. And Sandoval and Alvarado were like, why should we go indeed? Cortes wanted to go there, but we actually think that if we arrive there, they will make us prisoner, and they will send us to capital to be sacrificed by Aztecs as sort of a payment. They will buy their own freedom and their own lives to Tlaxcalans by delivering us to the Aztecs. But Malinche replied to that you guys idiot. I mean, she was supposedly used quite a rough language with them that those two rough soldiers would understand. She called them idiots and dogs, and they don't understand it. Like, you are nothing to Aztecs. You just showed up with your horses, and they don't actually think much of you. Tlaxcalans were their enemies for hundreds of years. They are the one they really hate. There is never going to be peace between them, and there is going to be no forgiveness. Tlaxcalans are more vested in that than you are. And Sandoval was, you see, Pedro, the woman knows what she's talking about. Let's go. And so they went, and she was right. And once they arrived, they were received by Tlaxcalans with all sorts of honors. The chief of Tlaxcalans, one of the chief of Tlaxcalans, told them, we saw of you as a very brave man. After what you did that night in Tenochtitlan, make us think about you as gods. Regroup here, you will be fine. And find you where. Cortes, after a few days in coma, recovered. Can I take a 2 minutes break and just drink my tea, and we will spend another 25 minutes, I think? Alina, we okay with that? You're muted.
Yeah, you want to take a break?
Just 2 minutes, and I want to drink tea and see if anybody has questions right now or something like that.
Do you guys have any questions?
On the edge of our seats. Sorry, I was saying we are on the edge of our seats, so a little break is good.
You're at the age of you. I mean, it's sort of a cliffhanger. Good.
No, not this part. Just overall, it's like a really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I almost finished my borscht. I'm cooking borscht as I'm listening.
I'm not hungry just yet. All right, that's good. That's good. I realize no, I'm not hungry.
Zheleznyak is like, oh, borscht, that sounds amazing.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Have you ever done this presentation to a Mexican audience? Because it seems like not very favorable to the Mexican, point of view here. And I'm just wondering if you done that or
So,
dealt with this critique.
So good point. I had, generally speaking, I have, when I do the longer presentation, you can see that I present facts as I was told from the British point of view. I'm extremely dismissive generally not dismissive. I'm very unkind to Spaniards. Am I unkind to Aztecs? I actually unkind to one person in particular, to Emperor Moctezuma, I think. I had a Mexican Spanish teacher, and we had plenty of arguments. That's of course. So like, I would say I don't deviate much from what I say from perspectives of most of the British scholars. Am I being unfair? I don't think so. I think if you take a Spanish point of view, who thinks that the Brits are, all what I'm telling to you right now is a British propaganda, and they all were honorable men, and all they did was keeping their word and bringing Catholicism and saving those natives from paganism and saving their souls. And the only reason they've done all that and destroyed the civilization was in order to bring wonderful Christianity to them. And the Brits just like painting everything, them like, and killing people and destroying people. And the point of view of left-wing Mexican who would say that Aztec Empire was all great and there's no dark sides to that, I think I'm keeping it in the middle. And the end, I will talk about that from the perspective of, I guess, Mexican. Mexico is a Mestizo country. As of now, as of 100 years ago. The Mexican national idea, as was developed in the late 19th century by the university professors, by the lecturers of the University of Mexico, under pretty much orders of Porfirio Diaz, who was a dictator at the time, was that Mexico is the nation that has two parts to that. It has European part, the Spanish part, and it has the native part. They are the only true, that was the idea, the true Mestizo nation, the nation that incorporated two. Through the very painful process of one nation conquering another, the Mexican nation was born. So they neither white nation, they neither Indian nation, they are mixed nation, they are Mestizo, they are Mexicans, that their country. And there is no country quite like that. There is no nation quite like that. So it depends. What I'm delivering to you depends on where on the spectrum of Mexican society you are. If you are left wing, as my Mexican teacher, or like Spanish teacher in Mexico was, and she was the member of PRI and dressed all in leather always, and being very very left wing. What I'm telling you is probably blasphemy from the perspective of some university professors. Probably it's fine. So we go like that. It's a great question. I really liked it. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I only heard the American version. I heard like a 10-minute version in American high school. So I haven't really heard the detail before. So I've seen this more left-wing perspective online recently, but just wondering.
All right, shall I continue?
Go for it.
All right. So Cortes arrived at Tlaxcala, and his luck. Again, we're talking about luck and fortune. He just survived being, I mean, almost dying, and his army collapsed. But as he was recovering in Tlaxcala, his luck turned again to the positive side. He started receiving help from various type of allies. The first type of allies was very visible and tangible to Cortes. He started to receive reinforcement. It just happened that almost as if from nowhere, at least 6 ships arrived at the port of Veracruz, carrying people, carrying guns, carrying gunpowder, carrying horses, carrying people. Some of them were sent by Velazquez to support the Narvaez expedition, and those people joined Cortes, of course. Some of them were sent by the governor of Jamaica, de Garay, who wanted the part of Mexico for himself, and they instead joined Cortes expedition. Some came from his father, who received the gold and sent ships to support his son in Mexico. So all of a sudden, after losing half of his army, for whom he sorrowed, of course, Cortes nevertheless was very happy that he now, his army get such a huge reinforcement that seems like nothing happened. And he got more horses and he got more guns. It's actually very important for his own plans. The second ally was invisible. And that was something that Cortes couldn't comprehend, didn't know about, but some forces, some very dreadful and terrible forces, started actually working for him. The first sign of that, and I'm sure you'll figure out on your own what it is, but I won't say it because Cortes didn't know. He received the news all of a sudden from the intelligence from the capital that he found out that the young man, the new emperor, Kutloak, seemingly great warrior, and the young healthy man, just died all of a sudden. Who knows? Maybe he had a heart attack or something. Cortes was surprised, but didn't have time to think about that. Cortes had some new ideas. Or maybe it wasn't an old idea after all, but remember, Cortes asked one thing of Malinche, if the chief carpenter is still there. Cortes' idea was there is no way to conquer that city just by marching there over those terrible viaducts. What we're gonna do, we're gonna build the brigantines on the lake and Tlaxcalan Valley. We're gonna bring them down the streams or up the streams wherever's necessary. If we need to, we will be rolling them. If we need to, we will build the channels that will connect 2 rivers. We'll bring them to the Valley of Mexico, and we're gonna lay siege. And so carpenters went to build the brigantines. They were successful after the first few months, and from December to April, they were building them. And in the April of 1521, Tlaxcalan allies mostly brought those brigantines using the network of rivers, digging the channels, or just pushing them on the build platforms. They brought the brigantines into the Valley of Mexico and deployed it into the lake that was surrounding the capital. The siege began. The Aztecs elected the new emperor in place of deceased Cuauhtemoc. The name was Cuauhtemoc. The name was attacking eagle, as you can see an eagle that goes for the prey on his shield. It was a young, cool-minded man who was originally against the confrontations with the Spaniards, but long changed his mind. He was a military leader. He was one of the leaders that led Aztecs into the battle for Tenochtitlan. He was very capable. He knew very well that diplomacy at that point was as important as his armies. He was a very serious, formidable foe for Cortes. What was happening during the siege, as was the battle for the rest of the empire to a certain extent, because Aztecs had garrisons. They had people stationed all over, the army stationed all over the country. Cortes, needing allies, everyone would send his emissaries to to Aztecs vassals, to various cities, city-states, and the regions, trying to convince them to join their side. Many would, as they were promised no sacrifices, as they were promised delivery from evil, as they were just showing some military muscle by the Cortes. Some wouldn't, but those who would eventually be attacked. As the Cuauhtemoc would order the Aztecs to bring them back on their side. They would be attacked. Cortes would send his men to protect his newly found allies. Cuauhtemoc would coordinate attacks on different parts of the country, so Cortes wouldn't be able to help everyone. So it was that sort of slowly going war for the territories and for the alliance with various Aztecs vassals that was going all over the country. And sometimes Cortes would have an upper hand, and sometimes Aztecs would have the upper hand. But what it was doing is that it was causing problem in the capital. For Aztecs, it was a problem because the siege was continuing. While Canu would attack all the time brigantines, they were not able to overpower them. While Cortes, and the brigantines were not able to prevent all the fast canoe to reaching the shores, and so Cuauhtemoc was able to communicate with the Aztecs or his allies outside the city. What brigantines were certainly capable to do is to prevent from supplies coming into the city. City was cut from the rest of the world in terms of getting food, in terms of getting fresh water. It was a problem, right? The city was under siege. And of course, they would bombard the city, as they had now a lot of guns that were installed on the brigantines. After several months of siege, on June 10th, Cortes decided that city is ready to be taken. He directed the brigantines to bombard the city and to provide the cover for three-tongued attack. Cortes over the viaducts. Cortes would lead the horsemen, and the Spaniards would go in over the three viaducts from three sides, and Cortes would lead horsemen and infantry on one through one viaduct. Sandoval and Pedro Alvarado would be leading the other two. That was the second battle for Tenochtitlan, and once again, Cortes was given a lesson. That was yet disaster for Spaniards. For the second time, Aztecs were victorious. For the second time, they destroyed huge number of Cortes. It turns out that brigantines, while they were attacked by canoes on all sides, were not able to provide protection for the soldiers. They were trying to cross the viaducts, and as they were attacked by Aztecs on three sides, they again had to turn back, and while being killed in numbers. At some point, Cortes was taken by Indians, by Aztecs. He became a prisoner for a few moments. At that time, they should just finish him. There's no doubt. When Cortes was in their hands, Aztecs should have just finished that man. But that's not what Aztecs wanted to do. To bring end to this invasion, they realized by that time they need to sacrifice the main man. They need to take them prisoner, they need to bring him to the city, and he needs to be properly sacrificed to the god Huitzilopochtli, the sun god that Cuauhtemoc was the big follower of. The hesitation to kill Cortes ended up with him being released. His captains and his personal bodyguard, Cristobal de Alia, were able to cut the hands of the people who were holding him and release Captain. De Alia died that day, but Cortes survived. He continued to fight even though there were wounds. He made it alive, but his army was demoralized. His attack was a disaster, and he lost a lot of soldiers. Next day, Cuauhtemoc issued the proclamation that within the 8 days, there is going to be no Spaniards left in the Valley of Mexico. They're all going to be rotting dead, he said. He was sending messages to his former vassals who switched sides to Spaniards. He was sending heads of Spaniards. He was sending torsos of horses. He was making a clear message. You either go back to us, and that's going to happen to you. Because if you think that those people are going to protect you, think better. Cortes and Spaniards were terrified. They fortified every position that they had, and they were expecting an attack on the 8th day. They also saw that most of their allies all of a sudden gone. Only Tlaxcalans, Tacubans, and a couple more other tribes stayed. Those desperados who pretty much believed that there is no forgiveness for them after what they've done. 8 days came and went, an attack never happened. 2 weeks passed, an attack never happened. Cortes wasn't sure what's going on. What he noticed, that there is not much activity. The viaducts were not, nobody works on the viaducts anymore. Nobody's trying to destroy them or fix them if the attack is to be carried on. Eventually, he found out what happened. 2 people, 2 Aztecs, pretty much delirious in their pain and of high fever, were brought to him. They were city citizens. When Cortes saw them, everything became clear. There was a smallpox epidemic going on in the capital, and the people were dying. As I said, there was a terrible ally that Cortes received. That was a smallpox that at that time was raging in various parts of the capital of the country, and it was killing people in the capital. That's why Cuauhtemoc died, and that's why attack wasn't coming. It turns out that the second battle for Tenochtitlan was indeed the last stand of the healthy Aztecs, but healthy people were no more. As Cortes found out that the city is being is dying slowly, or not so slowly anymore. He tried to reach to Cuauhtemoc, promising that if city surrenders, he will leave it stand and is not going to destroy it. Cuauhtemoc actually considered and had a high council to discuss it and rejected. Certainly for him personally, that was not an option. Neither honor nor his worldview would do nothing. Unlike Montezuma, more like most of the other Aztecs, he valued the afterlife, the world as a whole, much more than his personal life. The idea that the city will stand was appealing because the city was important in their worldview, but it still wasn't as important as accepting some other religion and some other overlords. And so Cortes launched the attack one more last time. We can call it the third battle for Tenochtitlan, or we don't have to call it that because there was not much. There were two quarters of the city that put up some resistance, but those people were sick and were barely standing. As Cortes entered the city, he saw how nobleman and peasant alike were dying in pain, not able to take care for themselves. It is said to be extremely painful of a disease. Cortes went looking for Emperor Cuauhtemoc. He did find him, and he committed at that point one of his despicable acts, and he tortured the young man who recovered from. He was sick. Cuauhtemoc was sick with smallpox, but he recovered, and he tortured the young man. He tortured him because of greed. He was looking for gold. As you remember, he left 4/5 of the gold, roughly, in the capital, in the palace. The gold wasn't found upon their return. So he was torturing poor Cuauhtemoc, and the man would say nothing. The popular culture, as we speak, what the Mexicans think about it, the popular culture would say that Malinche would provoke Cortes to do that, was instigating the torture until the poor man died. That's altogether incorrect. The poor man didn't die that day. Malinche begged with Cortes to stop it, and he stopped. He was saying that the poor man doesn't know anything. Cuauhtemoc lived to see another day. Cortes had to keep him on the leash because he was afraid that he would start rebelling. He didn't want to kill young men for various reasons, some political, some personal. But during Cortes' disastrous trip to south to Honduras, Cuauhtemoc did indeed try to start a rebellion among local minds. Cortes saw that he had enough at that point and had him executed for treason. But that happened several years later. That way died last, not great, there was no title great, but last emperor of the Aztec, Cuauhtemoc, the eagle, not from smallpox, like his uncle, not from the hand of his own people, like his other uncle, but trying to fight against his enemies till the end. As Cortes was torturing poor men, the Tlaxcalan allies were given a free ticket to do wherever they want with the city. And Tlaxcalans, being hating Aztecs for the things they did to them over 200 years, went on the rampage, killing anyone and everyone they would found and stealing things that they would want. Cortes asked them and Tacubans and some other allies to start destroying the city. In a matter of weeks, the stone town, the old beautiful city of dreams, was destroyed, and on its place, Cortes founded new colonial Ciudad de Mexico, which is also beautiful, that we can see today. There are very few things remain from the Aztecs times, mostly in the historical center. Over the next few years, Cortes would take care of the Aztec Empire and conquer all of that territory with help of some other conquistadors and some other expeditions. Pretty much after the capital went down, it was a matter of months as Cortes and his forces and his allies took care of the rest of the Aztecs. So by the 1524, Cortes captured most of the Aztec Empire. More importantly to him, he found a lot of gold and silver mines. So everything that he lost in the capital, in the palace, he was able to regain through his own excavations, through the mines, and hundreds of times. He became a very rich person, the second richest person after the King of Spain indeed, and that was very important to him because he needed to pay his soldiers. He was planning to use the gold in the palace, and at some point it was quite ugly when he didn't have anything to pay them with. But eventually it worked out for him. By the end of the 16th century, everything that's modern-day Mexico, as well as the parts of the United States, became known as Nueva España, the one huge Spanish domain in New World. Montezuma had few sisters and other relatives who survived their deal. They were sent to Spain. King of Spain didn't took it light. I mean, the family, the royal family didn't took it lightly at all. That Cortes and his men killed members of another royal family, especially the one that was agreeing to have kings of Spain as their overlords. They didn't like craftsmen killing nobility at all. That's why we will never find out who indeed killed Montezuma in reality. But they certainly, those relatives of Montezuma who survived were taken care of by the king, by the royal family. They were made Spanish nobility, and some of their descendants still have titles in Spain. And I think Juan Carlos just made some of them, give them some other honors just recently. That's their story. Hernan Cortes became second richest person in the world for the time being. He was made the Marquis by the king. The king really loved all the gold and silver he was receiving from the New World, even if the original one disappeared. For all his services, the expedition was pronounced legal, and he was made the Marquis de Oaxaca, and given the title of marshal, which allowed him to do any sort of conquest he ever wanted. What he didn't receive, he didn't get a confirmation of being the viceroy of the new territory. Somebody else was appointed, and Cortes was forever bitter the king didn't do it. He petitioned king many times, but never was given that status. Nevertheless, Cortes, who, as I mentioned during my first part, was probably the more noble man that the rest of Spaniards. Certainly, we cannot compare him to Pizarro brothers, who were real scum in Peru, and to his own men. Unlike Pizarro brothers, he actually lived another 25 years to enjoy the riches that he got in the New World. To his honor, we have to say that he quickly realized that the slavery was the wrong thing and worked alongside the bishops to at least outlaw the slavery. He was not by any mean nice person or cared that much, but at least he considered the slavery being anti-Christian and inhuman. For the mid-16th century, it wasn't that bad. As I mentioned in my answer, Mexican have that very, it appears that there is that thing in Mexican psyche that the country was born out of fire and war and death, but like Phoenix, from the conflict between two races, something new was born. As I mentioned, Malinche became Cortes' lover. More, she became the love of his life. He was the person beside himself that he cared for most, at least until their son was born. They had 4 children, 3 daughters, and the son Martin. He made Martin, he paid King and paid Vatican a lot of money to pronounce Martin Spaniard, being born in Toledo, and in sort of Mexican national idea, as was scripted in the 19th century, Martin is sort of the first mestizo, the Indian boy with blue eyes. Malinche remained his lover for a number of years. He never married her, but he married her for somebody else. She was a very wealthy, extremely wealthy person, and extremely respected by most Spaniards. Of course, she is hated in Mexico as a traitor and enabler. Her story, as you may remember, was that she was sold into the slavery by her own mother, the queen of one of the vassals to Aztecs, and was treated as a slave girl for the native until she got into Cortes' possession, literally, as she was gifted to Cortes. And I guess it's very hard to blame her for siding with the people who showed her so much respect, as the roughest guy in expeditions would shut up when she spoke. She had kids with Cortes and then with her legal marriage, and as she was so wealthy that the fight for her inheritance was going for quite a while between her 8 children. Tlaxcalans, the supporters of Cortes, received everything that Cortes promised them, which is very unusual for the way Spaniards would deal with the locals, but there was a happy story. For a while, they became free people under the crown. They were reporting not to Mexico City, but directly to King of Spain. They had their own rulers, and they were given the request, the permission to conquer other lands. They were allowed to have other Indians working for them. They took a part in expeditions, in the Spanish expedition up north to the modern day New Mexico. And if you ever in Santa Fe, I'm sure you will see what people say the oldest Catholic church, or rather any church in the continental United States. And this church actually wasn't built by the Spaniards. It was built by Tlaxcalans for themselves, as they were very devout Catholics. Their story became very bitter when they were hit by plague, not smallpox, but the plague in the 17th century, and most of them who remained in Tlaxcala, most of the population died. It was repopulated by former expats that were living in modern day New Mexico, and they are still there, still carrying their original Tlaxcalan's name, being very religious, very right-wing. They love Spain, they love Juan Carlos out there, and they don't like the rest of the Mexico. because they're the traitors from the perspective of most Mexicans, and they believe that all the changes that happened since independence are not for the good. And it's not me saying that what you see over there on the picture, that's in the Palacio de Gobierno. If you ever there and go there, you will see the Mexican history in an extremely right-wing way. If you go to Presidential Palace in Mexico City and see Diego Rivera's history, it's according to Aztecs, it's according to liberals, it's according to the social agenda. If you go to the Palacio de Gobierno in Tlaxcalan capital of that state, you will see similar frescoes done by the local Tlaxcalan artist. It just like it worked according to Tlaxcalan, according to the right wing, according to the love for the kings and conservatives. Those guys that you see over here are the Totonacs, the people who first met Cortes. They still there. They protected. I mean, they sort of like protected minority kind of thing. They have the festivals and they keep growing up vanilla. They were the first people who grow vanilla. They still do that. The last of my presentation, that's the gold that Cortes lost, the gold that he, for which he was torturing poor Cuauhtemoc. The gold was discovered in the 1980s, the huge load of gold, huge win for the government. I mean, that was huge find in Centro Histórica. It was always suspected and speculated that's the gold that Cortes lost the night of the Noche Triste. And the start, just 2 months before pandemic and the start of the January of 2020, they finally have technology to prove that was it. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zed. That was awesome.
Sorry, Alina, I'm 15 minutes over.
Only 15
We start
minutes.
late. We start late.
Yep, all good.
You wanna let people ask myself questions?
I'm gonna unmute everyone, or I guess people can unmute themselves. And yep, opening the floor up for questions.
Hi, Kosha. Not to start a new thing, but just a quick question. How much time passed since the end of your story until Coronado went north for the first time with his expedition to the United States? I mean, to the land we know as United States now.
I think he went in 56. No, I think he went in the 50. I think he went there in unless I'm mistaken. I think he went in the 1556. So like 30 years.
Okay, so pretty soon.
Pretty soon. Yes, because like I would need to check, but I think it was 1556. Anybody else? I hope it wasn't that boring.
I think it was just a lot of information to take in, and people need some time to process it. All right, well, if there is no more questions, maybe you want to give a quick preview of your tours that are coming up. I know we were talking about this up front.
Well, thank you. Sure. As I said during the start of the last talk, I'm not a historian. I'm a tour guide. I take people to various places again. Various places in Latin America. Mexico is the country I love most, or the country I love. Used to work and live there. So I travel there a lot. I go to the places where usually people don't go. I talk Mexican Revolution, Mexican War for Independence, Cortes story, and I show colonial Mexico and ancient Mexico, whatever is left of that. I also go to South America. I think in South America, my favorite country is Ecuador, for whatever personal reasons, I guess, rather than anything else. It's so I do that. If anybody is interested, I will be very happy to if you send me your emails, I would add you to our mailing list. We don't spam. I send at the peaceful time. I send one message in a couple months. I mean, every other month we just send our schedule and nothing else. If you're interested to travel with me, Alina have been with me a couple times to actually to Mexico and Ecuador. Yeah, I talk architecture, I talk history, and in Ecuador we go to a lot of national parks. It's a lot about nature out there. Besides that, I during the pandemic, since I don't travel, I do talks. My usual talks twice as long. I to give more details usually. So like if you're interested in some other subjects in the history of Mexico and Latin America, I will be very happy if you join my talks next time. So that's been sort of my gigs during the pandemics, as I don't have an opportunity to travel and take people to the places I love. I guess that's my spiel. I will be very happy to hear from anyone.
Thank you, Zhe, and thanks for making the time to talk. I will.
No, thank you. I'll thank you, Alina, for having this series. It's amazing, and I really love being here. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then I guess we're done for the night, and I'll follow up with the video.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right.
Спасибо, спасибо.
Wow,
Thank you.
thank you.
Гоша, мы
Amazing.
все сейчас придем на борщ.
Окей. Я могу вам показать его, но я не думаю, что я не буду лучше не дразниться.
Это да, это не очень nice.
Gosha, where are you right now?
I'm in my Harlem apartment.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
back
you
in
live.
the
Okay.
city.
He's back to the city.
Yeah, just for a couple of weeks, and then I'm back to Bay Area. Yeah.
I have a question for the person who asked me the question about the Mexican thing. I mean, what the Mexicans would think about that. I see it's Tanya, but I'm not sure.
It's Shannon.
Shannon. I was wondering, Shannon, I mean, was I able to answer your question, or would you like at some point to have more discussion to that? If
I'm interested in I just find it very interesting, and I want to know more about what people are saying today. I mean, I know that kind of promoting the Indian history, or the native history is more popular today than it's ever been. So
I think it is great and important. I think keeping the balance of what is real and what wasn't real is difficult. But I just thought about one more example to tell you. So 20 years ago, in the part Coyoacan, where Cortes had his house built, they installed a statue to him, Malinche, and little Martin. And there was protests against that installation and counter protest against that installation. And then somebody stole the boy. So now that it's still there, but there is no, Martin is not there anymore. So it is a complicated thing for Mexicans, that's for sure, the whole story, because the villains there, the Spaniards, they steal the part of their, I mean, they're the part of their DNA, right? There's very few pure Indians left in Mexico. Most of them métissos, the mixed race. So it's kind of very hard to be to find the balance and to work with that, right? That your fathers pretty much raped your mothers in the historical perspective, and that's how your nation was born. So it is a very complex thing, but that's I guess sort of a separate discussion from this presentation. So here we go. I saw that you may enjoy that little story. All right, guys. I think I'm done.
Okay. And I love you all, but I gotta shut down.
Thank
this
you,
room.
Alina. Bye. Sorry it
Okay.
takes long as usual. Bye.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.